Picture the most ordinary Tuesday morning you can imagine. The kind where the coffee is already brewing before your alarm goes off. The kind where the birds outside sound almost rehearsed. The kind where nothing in the world, not a single thing, gives you any reason to believe that by the end of the week, everything you thought you knew about your life will have turned out to be a carefully constructed performance. That is where this story begins. Not with a dramatic explosion, not with a phone call in the middle of the night. It begins on a Tuesday morning, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Middle America, where a woman named Karen was doing exactly what she had done for the last 12 years. She was making breakfast for her children, waiting for her husband to come home, and believing completely, fully, without a single doubt, that she knew who that man was. She didn't. And what she was about to discover would not just shatter her marriage. It would shatter her understanding of what a human being is even capable of sustaining. Most people who have been betrayed will tell you the same thing when you ask them about the moment they found out. They'll tell you it wasn't one big moment. They'll tell you it was 1,000 small ones, a receipt left in a pocket, a name that didn't belong, a pause before answering a question that was just a fraction of a second too long, and that suddenly, all at once, all those small moments lined up and made sense in a way they could no longer look away from. Karen will tell you the same thing. She'll tell you the clues were there, not hidden in some spy thriller kind of way, not buried under layers of elaborate deception so complex that any normal person would have missed them. They were just sitting there, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment she was finally ready to see them. But here is what makes Karen's story different from almost every other story of betrayal you have ever heard. Here is what makes it land differently. Here is what makes it stay with you long after you've finished hearing it. His other family, his other wife, his other children, his other entire life lived 3 streets away. 3 streets. Not a different city, not a different state, not even a different neighborhood. 3 streets. The same grocery store, the same post office, the same school district, the same 4th of July parade route. For 12 years, 2 women loved the same man, cooked dinner for the same man, raised his children, built a home with him, believed they were the center of his world. And they did all of it 3 streets apart, and neither one of them knew. Tonight, we are going to find out how a man sustains something like that. We are going to find out what it costs, what it requires, and what happens when the machine finally breaks. And we are going to find out what happened between these 2 women when the truth finally came out. Because that part of the story is the part that nobody expects, and the part that I still think about every single time I sit down to tell it. Stay with me, because the ending of this story, I still cannot believe it myself. Before we go back to the beginning, and we are going to go all the way back to the beginning, you need to understand the full shape of what this man built. Because when most people hear the phrase double life, they imagine something cinematic. They imagine a man living in 2 different cities, flying back and forth, keeping 2 phones, sweating under the pressure of it all. They imagine something that feels, at some fundamental level, inherently unsustainable. Something that could only ever last a few months before the weight of it caused everything to collapse. What David, and that is the name we are going to use for this man throughout this story, what David built was not that. What David built was something far more methodical. Something that required not just deception, but a kind of almost architectural thinking. A man who didn't just maintain 2 relationships. A man who designed and maintained 2 complete, fully functioning lives. With 2 sets of children, 2 households, 2 interlocking social circles, 2 separate emotional worlds. For over a decade. In the same zip code. Here is the part that keeps stopping people when they hear this story for the first time. David had been with his first family, a woman we will call Michelle, and their 2 children, before he ever met Karen. He and Michelle had been together for years. They had a life. They had a home. They had a routine. And then, without ending any of that, without making any kind of clean break, without ever sitting Michelle down and having the conversation that every decent person eventually has to have, David simply began a second life alongside the first one. He met Karen, he fell for Karen, And instead of choosing, instead of doing the hard, honest, painful thing that the situation required, he expanded, he added, he kept both. And then he kept both of those lives going. Simultaneously for 12 years, within walking distance of each other, while 4 children grew up calling him Dad, while 2 women believed they were his one and only, while neighbours waved at him from their driveways and thought of him as one of the nicest guys on the block. So here are the questions that are going to drive everything we talk about tonight. How does a man actually do that? Not just logistically, though the logistics, when you hear them, are genuinely staggering, but psychologically. What does it take to look 2 different women in the eyes, night after night, year after year, and never let the mask slip? What does it do to a man to live like that? What does it do to the people around him? And when it all finally came apart, when Karen found out, when Michelle found out, when the 2 worlds that had existed in such careful, deliberate separation suddenly collided, what did that actually look like? We are going to answer all of those questions tonight. But first, you need to meet the man at the center of all of it, because nothing about him is going to look the way you expect. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos now. Let's go back to the beginning. David grew up in a mid-sized town in the American Midwest, the kind of place where the high school football team mattered deeply, where everybody knew your parents' names, where the diner on Main Street had been run by the same family for 3 generations. He was the second of 3 children. His father worked in construction, and his mother was a school secretary. A woman described by people who knew her as endlessly warm, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and always had something on the stove. David was, by most accounts, a good kid. Not perfect, not the most academically driven, but likable in a way that went beyond charm, genuinely likable. The kind of likable that comes from an ability to make other people feel understood. His childhood friends would describe him as the guy who could talk to anyone. The guy who walked into a room and just naturally found a way to connect with whoever was standing in front of him. He wasn't the quarterback. He wasn't the valedictorian. He was something that is in some ways harder to define and ultimately, as we will see, far more consequential. He was the guy people trusted on instinct. Not because he had done anything specific to earn it, but because something in the way he carried himself communicated safety, ease, warmth. People liked David before they had any real reason to. That quality, and it is worth pausing on this, because it matters enormously to everything that follows, was not a manipulation tactic. It was not something he deployed consciously. It was simply who David was, or at least it was the most visible part of who David was. What lay underneath it? What complicated it? What ultimately weaponized it against 2 women who deserved far better? That would take years to fully surface. By the time David was in his early 20s, he had started working in logistics coordination, a job that required him to manage supply routes, shipment schedules, vendor relationships across multiple locations. It was, in retrospect, almost poetically perfect for the kind of life he would end up building. The work required him to be organized across multiple fronts simultaneously, to keep many moving pieces from colliding, to maintain clarity and calm in situations where disorder was always threatening to break through. He was good at the job. His employers described him as reliable, detail-oriented, someone who never seemed overwhelmed even when the workload suggested he probably should have been. He was the kind of employee you could give a complicated problem to on a Friday afternoon and know it would be handled by Monday morning. The professional competence and the personal charisma operated side by side, and together they made David into someone who attracted both professional trust and personal loyalty in equal measure. That is when he met Michelle. She was working at the same company in an administrative capacity. Organized, focused, the kind of person who kept things running quietly in the background while other people took the credit for it. Michelle's friends describe her as the backbone of every room she entered. Not in a loud way, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way that everyone instinctively knew things would hold together as long as she was there. She had a dry sense of humour, a loyalty that ran bone deep, and a love of routine that made her, in some ways, a perfect counterpart to David's more outwardly social energy. They started dating. Things moved the way things move when they feel right. Not rushed, not uncertain, just forward. They moved in together. They talked about the future. And then Michelle became pregnant with their first child. David was 24 years old when his first son was born. And by every account, Michelle's account, the account of the friends who watched them during those early years, he was present. He was involved. He changed diapers at 2 in the morning and showed up to pediatrician appointments and coached the Little League team when his son got old enough to play. He was, in the vocabulary of fatherhood, a good dad. Michelle's mother loved him. Her friends liked him. He fit into her life the way a piece fits into a puzzle, like it had always been meant to go there. They had a second child. They bought a house. And for a period of time, a few years at least, it really did look from the outside like exactly what it appeared to be. A young family building something real, which makes what came next all the more difficult to explain. Somewhere around the time their second child was born, something in the relationship between David and Michelle began to strain. The specifics, as is usually the case with the private mechanics of a relationship, are not entirely clear. What Michelle has said publicly is that David became more distant. Not cruel, not volatile, but absent in the way that some people become absent when they are mentally somewhere else entirely. He was physically present, but increasingly hard to reach. Conversations that used to flow easily became shorter, more surface level, more perfunctory. She put it down to the stress of a second child, to work pressure, to the accumulated fatigue of early parenthood. She did not put it down to what it actually was, which was that David had already begun dividing himself. It was around this time that David met Karen. She was 26, working as an office manager for a small insurance firm about 20 minutes from the neighbourhood. A mutual friend introduced them at a backyard gathering on a warm summer Saturday, the kind of afternoon that exists in the memory as almost golden in retrospect. All lawn chairs and cold drinks and easy laughter. Karen had been in a couple of serious relationships before this. Nothing that had lasted. Nothing that had ended in a way that left lasting damage. She was, her friends say, deliberate about who she trusted. Not guarded in a wounded way, but careful in a measured way. Someone who did not give her heart easily, but who, when she gave it without reservation. She was the kind of woman, her best friend would later say, who would have made an extraordinary partner for any man who deserved her. David walked into that backyard gathering and within 2 hours had made Karen feel more seen than she had felt in years. Karen called her best friend the next morning and said, quietly, "The way you say something you half believe and half want someone to confirm for you." I think I just met my husband. And she was right. 3 years later, after a relationship that moved through the expected milestones, with the warmth and ease of two people who genuinely fit together, Karen and David married in a small church ceremony. Both families were there. The food was good, the flowers were simple, the speeches were heartfelt. It was, by every account from every person who attended, a perfect day. Karen wore a dress she had found on the 3rd try. David cried at the altar. The photographer later told Karen it was one of the most genuinely emotional weddings she had ever shot. Karen kept that photo on the mantel for 12 years. She had no way of knowing, and this is the part that requires a moment of stillness before you move past it, that 18 months earlier, on a Saturday in April, David had stood in a different context and made a different set of commitments to a different woman who also believed she was the only one. And that woman, Michelle, was 3 streets away, living in a house that David had helped pick out, raising children whose eyes looked like David's eyes, making plans for a future that David had promised he wanted, 3 streets away. And Karen, laughing at the reception, dancing with her new husband, full of nothing but hope, had no idea. To understand how David sustained this for 12 years, you have to understand that what he was running was not chaos. What he was running was a system, and not an improvised one, not something cobbled together on the fly when circumstances forced his hand, but a deliberate, almost architecturally precise structure that he had built from the ground up. and maintained with the kind of consistency that most people reserve for things they love. He had divided his week. Monday through Wednesday belonged to Michelle's household. Thursday through Saturday belonged to Karen's. Sundays rotated based on mental calendar he had apparently committed to memory with extraordinary accuracy. Whose children had activities, whose household needed his presence more that week, which set of obligations was most pressing. He had 2 phones, one for each life, each with a different number, each known only to the people in its corresponding world. He had 2 separate sets of finances, credit cards routed to different accounts, cash withdrawals timed carefully, so that neither woman would see a charge that didn't belong to her reality. He had 2 sets of friends, each group entirely unaware the other existed. He had learned the school schedules for 4 children. He had memorized 2 sets of doctors' names, 2 sets of grocery preferences, 2 sets of in-law birthdays. He had, over the course of more than a decade, essentially built and maintained 2 parallel identities. And he commuted between them the way other men commute between an office and a home, with such regularity and such apparent ease that neither family ever had reason to question the rhythm of it. He always came back. That was the thing both women would later say separately when asked what kept them from suspecting. He always came back. He was never fully gone long enough to trigger the kind of alarm that pushes a person into action. The cover story was the job. The logistics work was real, and it provided the perfect architecture for absence. Overnight runs, regional travel, last-minute schedule changes. The nature of logistics work is, by its design, irregular and demand-driven. You go where the work sends you, on timelines that shift without notice. Karen and Michelle had both internalized this framing so completely that it had stopped registering as unusual years before the truth came out. When David didn't come home on a Wednesday night, it was a long haul. When he was gone over a weekend, it was a regional coverage problem. The job explained everything. And so they stopped asking the job to explain itself, because the answer was always the same, and the man always came home eventually, and the life they shared with him, when he was present, was warm and real and worth waiting for. Here is where the first crack appeared. Not in Karen's world, and not in Michelle's world, but in the world of a 13-year-old boy. David's oldest son, Michelle's child, was the kind of teenager who noticed things. Sharp, curious in the way that adolescents become curious when they start to sense that the adult world around them is more complicated than they have been led to believe. He had seen his father's second phone, not once, several times. And more importantly, he had seen his father's face when that phone rang. There was a quality to that moment, a particular quality of alertness, of controlled urgency, that sat differently from the way his father looked when his regular phone rang. The boy didn't say anything to his mother. He was 13, and he loved his father. And the gap between what he was beginning to suspect and the life he actually wanted to be living in was a gap he was not yet ready to cross. But he started watching. 3 streets away, Karen's crack arrived in a jacket pocket. It was a weeknight in late autumn. David had been, according to the story he had told her, on an overnight job about 4 hours north. Karen was doing laundry. The entirely unremarkable, entirely ordinary act of doing laundry on a Thursday evening, when she put her hand into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a gas station receipt. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m. The location was a station 8 minutes from their house. On the night he was supposed to be 4 hours away. Karen stood in the laundry room for a long moment. Then she constructed an explanation, because the human mind is extraordinarily good at constructing explanations when the alternative is something it is not ready to face. He must have come back early. He must have forgotten to mention it. He probably didn't want to wake the kids. She put the receipt in the pocket. She finished the laundry. She went to bed. But she did not forget it, and that is the thing about cracks. They do not close on their own. You can plaster over them. You can look away from them. You can construct excellent explanations for why they don't mean what they look like they mean. But the structural integrity is already compromised. Over the next 3 months, Karen found herself doing something she had never done before in 12 years of marriage. She started paying attention differently. Not aggressively, not with the focused intensity of a woman who had decided she was looking for something. More quietly than that, more reluctantly than that. She paid attention the way you listen for a sound in the house at night, when you're not quite sure whether you actually heard something or whether you imagined it. She was listening, and gradually the sounds began to multiply. There was a cologne she didn't recognize, not his usual brand, not something she had bought him, not something with an obvious explanation. There was a charge on the credit card statement for a restaurant she had never been to, in their own city, on a night when he had been supposedly away. There was a birthday card in the glove box of his car, not signed to her, not signed by her. The handwriting on the envelope, a woman's handwriting she didn't recognize. Each of these things, taken individually, had a possible explanation. Together, they did something different. Together, they began to assemble a picture. Karen was not ready to look at the picture directly, but she couldn't stop adding pieces to it. The moment that changed everything did not happen in the house. It did not happen in a confrontation, did not happen over a phone that buzzed at the wrong time. It happened in a school parking lot on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. Karen was picking up her youngest from an after-school activity, an arts showcase, the kind of Saturday afternoon event that fell outside their usual pickup routine. The kind of thing she had almost skipped because the week had been long and she was tired. She pulled into the parking lot and she found a spot, and she was sitting in the car waiting, scrolling through her phone with the easy distraction of someone who had 20 minutes to kill, when a woman she did not recognize caught her attention. There was nothing overtly remarkable about this woman. She was standing by an SUV near the edge of the parking lot. She was watching the entrance to the building with the particular focused attention of a parent waiting for a child. She had dark hair, and she was wearing a light jacket, and there was nothing in the world that should have made Karen keep looking at her. But Karen kept looking at her, and she couldn't explain why. There was something about the way this woman stood, something about the angle of her posture, something about the way she had positioned herself in the lot, that produced in Karen a feeling she could not name and could not dismiss. She watched the woman for a long moment. She watched a child run out of the building and across the parking lot toward her. And she watched the woman's face change in the way every parent's face changes when their child appears. That involuntary, unguarded softening that is impossible to perform and impossible to fake. And then the woman's phone rang, and the woman shifted the child onto her hip and answered it. And Karen, sitting 20 feet away with her window cracked and the spring air coming through, heard her say one word into the phone. One word in the easy, reflexive tone of someone answering a call from a person they speak to every day. David. Karen sat completely still in that parking lot for 11 seconds. She counted them later, because she remembered the counting, the strange, dissociated way her mind had reached for something concrete and measurable to hold on to in that moment. 11 seconds. Then her own child came out of the building and ran toward the car, and Karen assembled her face into something that looked like a regular Saturday afternoon. And she drove home, and she put her child to bed, and she waited. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table after the house went quiet, and she opened her laptop, and she began to pull the thread. She found Michelle's social media profile within an hour. It was semi-public, not locked down, not private, just the ordinary social media presence of an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. Family photos, neighborhood events, children's birthday parties, and there, in a post from approximately 4 years earlier, was David, smiling. His arm around this woman, around Michelle, in the easy, possessive way a man holds a woman he considers his. The caption read, "My rock. Love you, babe." Karen looked at the date. Then she looked at it again. She opened her phone, and she went to her own photos from the same date. It was their wedding anniversary. The same day, David had taken Karen to dinner and given her a card she had kept in the drawer of her nightstand. For 4 years, he had posted a photograph with another woman and called her his rock. Karen closed the laptop. Then she opened it again, because she was not done yet, and she knew she was not done yet, and the part of her that had been quietly paying attention for 3 months was not going to let her stop now. She kept searching. She found more photos. She found photos of Michelle's children, David's children. She now understood with a certainty that landed in her chest like something physical. And she looked at those children's faces, the jawline, the nose, the particular way one of the younger boys tilted his head when he was laughing, in a photograph taken at what appeared to be a birthday party. Her own son did that. She had always loved that about him, that little tilt, that particular expression of unself-conscious joy. She had always assumed it was hers, some feature of her own family that had passed down through genetics into the face of her child. It wasn't hers, it was David's, and it was in the face of a child 3 streets away. Karen printed 12 pages. She put them in an envelope, and at 11 o'clock at night she got into her car. Karen has been asked, many times since this story became known, what she was thinking on the drive to Michelle's house that night. She says she wasn't thinking. She says thinking had stopped somewhere around the 9th page she printed, and what had replaced it was something quieter and colder and more purposeful than thought. She knew the address from the social media profile, a detail that tells you something about how carefully David had managed the separation of these two worlds. Michelle's profile listed her neighborhood. The photos contained enough visual information. A street sign in the background of one, a house number half visible in another, that Karen, once she was looking with the right set of eyes, could locate it without difficulty. She parked on the street outside. She sat in the car for a few minutes. Then she walked up the path and rang the doorbell. It was 11:15 at night when Michelle answered the door. She was in pajamas, patterned flannel. The detail Karen would later recall with a strange specificity, the kind of detail the mind locks onto when everything else is too large to hold. Michelle opened the door and looked at Karen, and Karen looked at Michelle, and something passed between them immediately. Not recognition, not yet, but something prior to recognition. An understanding, arriving before the words arrived. Michelle has said that she knew, in the moment she opened that door, before Karen had said a single thing, that whatever had brought this woman to her doorstep at 11:15 on a Tuesday night was something she had been, in some part of herself, waiting for, not expecting, not planning for, but waiting for in the way you wait for something you have pushed out of your conscious mind, but that your body has been quietly bracing against for years. She opened the door wider. She stepped back. She said, "Come in." They sat at Michelle's kitchen table. There were 2 cups of coffee that Michelle made on autopilot, the way people perform small domestic acts when larger things are too enormous to approach directly. Between them on the table was the envelope. Karen opened it. She laid out the 12 pages, one by one, and she watched Michelle's face as Michelle looked at each one. Michelle was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone who is surprised. The quiet of someone who is watching a thing they already suspected take on definite shape, watching the fog resolve into a figure they had been half seeing for years. She asked some questions. Karen answered them. Michelle produced her own phone and began pulling up her own photographs, and Karen sat across from her and watched, and together, in Michelle's kitchen at midnight, they did what neither of them should have had to do. They built the truth from the pieces the same man had scattered across both their lives. They compared dates. They compared the travel stories, the overnight runs, the regional jobs, the work emergencies, and they watched, date by date, as each of David's absences from one life corresponded precisely with his presence in the other. The system became visible. The architecture revealed itself. They traced it backward across 12 years, and as they traced it, the sheer scale of it, the sheer sustained, deliberate, meticulous scale of it, grew in the room between them until it felt like something with physical weight. At one point, sometime around 1 in the morning, one of Michelle's children appeared at the top of the stairs asking for a glass of water. Karen looked up. The child, a boy, maybe 10 years old, half asleep and soft-edged in the way children are when they've been woken in the night, stood at the top of the stairs, squinting down into the kitchen light. And Karen saw David's face in that child, as clearly she had ever seen it anywhere. She has said that was the moment it became undeniably real. Not the receipts, not the social media posts, not even the conversation with Michelle. That child's face at the top of the stairs at 1 in the morning. That was the moment. Michelle got up, took the boy back to bed, and came back to the table. They sat together until almost 3 in the morning. By the time Karen left, they had agreed on one thing. They would not call David that night. They would wait. They would let him walk back into the life he thought was still intact, and then they would dismantle it with the same deliberateness with which he had built it. Karen drove home in the dark and sat in her kitchen and watched the clock and thought about 12 years of mornings and evenings and holidays and anniversaries and all the ordinary Tuesdays in between. And she thought about what all of it meant now and what it had cost. She did not sleep. David came home Thursday morning. This was the schedule. Thursday through Saturday belonged to Karen's household, and David arrived, as he always arrived, with a coffee from the drive-through and his keys in his hand, and the easy manner of a man stepping back into a life that was waiting for him exactly where he had left it. He set the coffee on the counter. He put his keys on the hook. He turned around and he saw the 12 pages laid out on the kitchen table. Karen was sitting in a chair at the end of the table. She did not say anything. She simply looked at him. David stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall for a long moment. Then he walked to the table. He looked at the pages. He pulled out a chair. He sat down, and he did not deny it. He did not reach for an explanation, did not construct a counter-narrative, did not perform surprise or outrage or any of the other emotional registers that might have introduced ambiguity into the moment. He sat down in the chair across from his wife, and he looked at the evidence of 12 years of deception laid out between them, and he said, "I was going to tell you. I just couldn't figure out when." He had been planning to tell her for 12 years. Karen has said that in that moment, something in her went very, very still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a person who has received a confirmation they already had, and is now adjusting to living inside the confirmed version of reality. She asked him questions. He answered them, all of them, with a directness and a completeness that she had not expected, and that, in its own way, was almost as disorienting as the deception itself. He told her about Michelle. He told her about the children. He told her about the system, the phone, the schedule, the cover stories, the financial architecture. He told it all with the affect of a man who had been holding something for a very long time and had simply, finally, run out of places to hold it. He cried. Karen watched him cry and felt nothing she could identify as either pity or contempt, only the strange, exhausted clarity of a woman who has just been handed the real map of her own life and is still learning to read it. The news spread through the neighborhood within 48 hours. This is the part of the story that people underestimate when they imagine a secret of this scale being revealed. The speed with which the community around it absorbs the information and reorganizes itself. Because here is the thing about living 3 streets apart that makes everything more complicated and more painful and more bizarre than it would have been in a cleaner geography. They had mutual acquaintances. Not close friends in common, not people who had been inside both houses, but the overlapping social fabric of a shared neighborhood. The neighbors you wave to, the parents you see at school pickup, the people you chat with at the block party, and the block party. The neighborhood block party from 3 summers earlier, which both families had attended, separately, on opposite ends of the street, without knowing they were, in the most literal possible sense, members of the same fractured household. People who had shaken Karen's hand and told her David was a lucky man had, the same afternoon, complimented Michelle on her children. The neighborhood was not just a setting for this story. It was a character in it. David's sister knew. This is the detail that surfaced in the days after the revelation, and that produced, in almost everyone who heard it, a particular kind of secondary anger. The anger reserved not for the primary betrayal, but for the silence that allowed it to continue. She had known for years. Not everything, Not the full architectural blueprint of the deception, but enough. She had met Karen at a family event early in the marriage and understood immediately that something was deeply wrong. She had not said anything. When she was later asked why, her answer was the answer of someone who had told themselves a story that became harder and harder to revise the longer she maintained it. I kept thinking it would end. I kept thinking he would sort it out himself. He had not sorted it out. And now the sorting was happening in the most public, the most painful, the most irrevocable possible way. With 2 women and 4 children and an entire neighborhood watching, Michelle, when she found out that David had been confronted at Karen's kitchen table, drove over. The 3 of them sat together for the first time. David and both women in Karen's living room, and the conversation that took place in that room over the course of 2 hours was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary conversations any of the people involved would ever have. David answered every question both women put to him. He did not attempt to minimize, did not attempt to manage the narrative, did not reach for the kind of carefully constructed half-truths that had kept the structure standing for 12 years, he answered. And what emerged from those answers was a portrait of a man that neither woman had expected. Not a monster, not a predator, not a pathological liar, in the sense of someone who lies reflexively about everything. Something more confusing than that. Something that required a different vocabulary entirely to describe. Psychologists who study infidelity and what is sometimes called compartmentalization disorder have a framework for understanding men like David. It is not a comfortable framework because it does not slot easily into the moral categories that betrayal usually invites. David was not, by the clinical assessments of the professionals who eventually became involved in the aftermath of this story, a sociopath. He did not score high on measures of callousness or predatory behavior. He did not, in any of the ways that such things are measured, appear to be a person who was indifferent to the suffering of others. What he appeared to be, instead, was a person with what clinicians sometimes call a profound conflict avoidance pathology, an inability deep-seated and apparently almost constitutional to face the direct, acute pain of ending things, of disappointing people he cared about, of choosing when choosing meant that someone he loved would be hurt by the choice. He had met Michelle first. He had loved her, genuinely, in his own complicated and ultimately insufficient way, loved her. And when the relationship began to strain under the weight of a second child and the accumulated pressures of early family life, he had done what conflict-avoidant people do. He had not stayed and worked through it. He had not left and faced the consequences of leaving. He had simply, and this is the word several people used when describing what David had done, and it is a word that contains more horror the longer you sit with it. He had simply expanded. He had found in Karen something that filled what was missing, and rather than make a clean choice between the life he had and the life he wanted, he had chosen, in the most literal possible sense, both. And then he had spent 12 years engineering a reality in which both choices could coexist without colliding. The word that both women kept returning to in the weeks and months after the truth came out was not the word you might expect. It was not liar, though he was. It was not coward, though there is an argument to be made for that, too. The word both women kept using, with a kind of exhausted, reluctant honesty that spoke to just how thoroughly David had made himself known to each of them over the years, was real. What he had with Michelle was real. What he had with Karen was real. His love for his children, all 4 of them, was real. His warmth, his attentiveness, his capacity for the daily acts of presence that make a person feel genuinely partnered, all of it was real. And that, in the end, is the thing that made this story not just painful but philosophically disorienting. Because the betrayal was built not out of performance, but out of genuine feeling. He had loved 2 women. He had simply not loved either of them enough to be honest. The legal situation that unfolded in the months following the revelation was complex in ways that illuminated something uncomfortable about the architecture of domestic partnership law in the United States. David had legally married only Karen. His relationship with Michelle, while fully domestic in every functional sense, lasting nearly as long as the marriage, involving shared property and shared children and every form of mutual obligation that a partnership entails, had never been formalized, which meant that Michelle had no spousal rights, no claim to marital assets, no protection under divorce law. What she had was a paternity case, which she pursued, and a civil claim for emotional damages, which she also pursued. Both were eventually settled, but the process of pursuing them required Michelle to make her way through a legal system that had no clean category for what she had been. Not a wife, not a girlfriend, not a domestic partner in any jurisdiction that might have offered her protection. Something in between, something the law had not adequately anticipated. What happened next? And this is the part that I always pause before I tell, because it requires the listener to do some work, to stretch toward something that does not match our expectations about how stories of betrayal usually go, is that Karen and Michelle retained the same lawyer. Together. They made that decision jointly, in a conversation that happened 3 weeks after the confrontation at Karen's kitchen table, when both women had had enough time to move past the initial shock and into the more complicated emotional territory of deciding what they actually wanted. They wanted different things legally, but they shared a fundamental understanding that had been forged at that kitchen table at 1 in the morning. The person they were negotiating against was David, not each other. And the most effective way to negotiate against David was to do it together. Their lawyer later described the case as one of the most unusual of her career, not for its legal complexity, but for the emotional dynamic between her two clients. She had expected competition, recrimination, the kind of secondary conflict that tends to erupt between people who have been hurt by the same source. Instead, she found two women who had already done much of their grief work in relation to each other before they ever walked into her office, who had somehow, in the space of those 3 weeks, arrived at a shared understanding that the person responsible for the damage was the person who had constructed the situation, not the person who had unknowingly inhabited the other half of it. It was not a simple or painless dynamic. There were hard conversations. There were moments of jealousy and anger that did not always find their appropriate target. But the fundamental orientation held. They were not each other's enemies. They were each other's witnesses. There is a detail about the 4 children that I want to spend a moment on, because it is easy to let it recede into the background of this story, and it should not. David had 4 children, 2 with Michelle, 2 with Karen. At the time the truth came out, the children ranged in age from 9 to 15. They were told the truth, age appropriately, carefully, with as much consideration for their individual capacities as the adults in the situation could manage under the circumstances, which were not ideal circumstances for careful, considered communication. The children were told that they had siblings they had not known about. Half-siblings, sharing a father, living in the same school district, attending some of the same activities. The eldest of David's children, the 13-year-old, who had noticed the Taxicon phone and had been quietly watching for months, received the confirmation with a kind of exhausted acceptance that was far older than 13. He had already known, or nearly known. The knowing had already been living in him for a while. What nobody had anticipated, what emerged slowly, painfully, awkwardly over the months that followed, was that the children, left to navigate the new reality of their siblinghood, largely on their own terms, began to find their way toward each other, not immediately, not without enormous complexity, but with a kind of gradual, genuine curiosity that the adults in the situation were in no position to manufacture and had not thought to engineer. They went to the same school district. They were going to see each other eventually. And rather than let that inevitability play out in the cafeteria or the parking lot without context, both mothers made a decision, together, as they were making most decisions by this point, to facilitate an introduction. A park. A Sunday afternoon. No pressure, no script, no expectation. Just 4 kids sitting on a bench with ice cream, trying to figure out what to say to the people who turned out to be their family. It was after that afternoon that one of Michelle's children came home and mentioned, in the casual, slightly bewildered way of a child reporting something interesting from the world, that one of Karen's boys had been on his Little League team the previous season. Same team, same practices, same games. They had played together for an entire spring and summer without knowing they were brothers. Both mothers sat with that information for a long time. Karen later said that when she heard it, she laughed. Not because it was funny, because in that moment, laughing was the only thing that stood between her and the full unmanageable weight of it. The universe had put these children in the same outfield, wearing the same colours, and the man responsible had been driving them both to practice. And neither of them had known they were carpooling with their brother. 2 years after the discovery, Karen and Michelle are close friends. I want to say that again because it bears repeating, because it is the kind of statement that tends to land and then require a moment to fully absorb. Not civil, not cordial, not the strained, performative politeness of 2 people who share obligations and manage their discomfort with professionalism. Friends. Real friends, in the way that word means something. People who have dinner together once a month, who call each other when something hard happens, who have built a relationship out of the specific shared wreckage of a specific shared experience, and who have found in that relationship something that neither of them could have found anywhere else, because nobody else has ever been exactly where they have been. Karen has described Michelle as the only person on Earth who doesn't need anything explained. Michelle has described Karen as the person I call first. What David destroyed without intending to, without having any idea it would happen, was the mechanisms by which these 2 women might never have met. What he also created, without intending to, was the condition for the most unlikely friendship either of them will probably ever have. David moved out of the neighborhood. He relocated to a different part of the state, far enough to remove himself from the daily geography of the damage he had caused, while remaining close enough to maintain the visitation schedules that both women's lawyers had worked to formalize. He pays child support for all 4 children, an arrangement that is legally binding and that, by most accounts, he has honored. He sees his children. The early visits were supervised, then gradually less so, as both mothers made separate and then jointly informed decisions about what was appropriate. He is described by both women, even now, with an absence of hatred that is perhaps the most striking emotional note in the entire aftermath. Not forgiven. That word has not been used by either of them, and neither has been asked to use it. But not hated. David exists in their lives now the way a geological event exists in a landscape, something that happened, that changed the shape of everything permanently, that you cannot undo and cannot fully explain, and cannot afford to be consumed by if you intend to go on living in the terrain it left behind. What both women have spoken about at length, in the conversations and the reflections that have come out of this story, is the question of what they missed. Not in a self-punishing way. Both are clear about the fact that they were not responsible for what they did not know, that the deception was not something they failed to detect, but something they were actively prevented from detecting by a person who devoted considerable effort to the prevention, but in a more philosophical way, a more honest way. The question of what it means to trust another person, what you are actually trusting when you trust someone. Whether what you are trusting is a person, or whether what you are trusting is a performance of a person. A performance that is consistent enough and warm enough and present enough that the distinction becomes functionally irrelevant until the moment it suddenly isn't. Karen has said, She does not regret the 12 years. She says it carefully, with the precision of someone who has thought hard about it, because she does not want it to be misunderstood as acceptance or endorsement or anything other than what it is. A reckoning with the fact that the life she lived was her life, that the love in it was her love, that her children are real, and her memories are real, and the person she became through those 12 years is the person she is now. She says what she grieves is not the marriage, it is the story. She thought she was inside a particular story. A story about a partnership, a shared project, two people building something together over a lifetime. It turned out she was inside a different story entirely. And nobody had asked her whether she wanted a role in that story. Nobody had given her the choice that should have been given to her before she ever walked into it. Michelle says something similar, but she arrives at it from a different direction. She had been with David longer. Her timeline was longer, her investment was deeper, her legal position was weaker, and the specific texture of her grief was coloured by all of those things. But she also says, and this is a thing she says with a directness that is completely characteristic of the woman her friends have always described, that what she grieves most is not the time. Time, she has said, is the one thing you cannot get back, but it is also the one thing that, properly understood, was never wasted, because everything that happened in it was real to her, and the children that came from it are hers, and those two things are not nothing. What she grieves is the choice. The choice that David made for her, without her knowledge and without her consent, for 12 years. The choice to keep her inside a story she didn't know she was in. A story she would not have chosen. A story that someone else authored and she performed without knowing she was performing. I would have made a different choice, she has said. I don't know what choice, but I would have had the right to make it, and he took that from me. There is one last detail. It is the detail I come back to every time I think about this story. The one that sits differently from all the others, because it contains within it a particular kind of vertigo. The vertigo of the near miss, of the almost and the just barely, and the moment that almost revealed everything but didn't. After everything came out, Karen went back through the years. She retraced the timeline, the geography, the social calendar, all of it. And she found evidence that on at least 6 separate occasions across the 12 years, the two families had been in the same place at the same time. The farmers' market on a June Saturday 4 years in. A 4th of July parade on the town's main street. A school district community event at a park on the east side 6 times. On each occasion, the evidence suggests that David had been aware of the proximity, had seen it coming, had positioned himself to manage it, had guided one family in a direction that would not intersect with the other. 6 times, 2 women who shared a husband had been within 50 feet of each other. 6 times, the whole thing had almost ended right there. And 6 times, a man who had become extraordinarily good at managing disaster had managed it one more time. Karen says she thinks about those 6 moments. She thinks about the version of herself standing at the farmer's market, 4 years into a marriage she believed in completely, 10 feet from a woman she did not know existed. She thinks about what it would have meant to turn and see that woman, to see her face, David's children at her side, and to understand in an instant what that meant. She thinks about whether that version of herself would have been better off knowing, whether the 10 years that followed would have been better traded for the clarity of that moment at the farmer's market. She does not have a clean answer. She has said she is glad she did not know, because she got to live those 10 years fully, got to love fully, parent fully, build fully, even if it was not the life she thought it was. And she has said, in the same breath, that she has never been able to fully square that feeling with the knowledge of what she deserved, which was the truth from the beginning, without exception. She got to live the life. She did not get to choose it. And now, she says this with the particular kind of quiet certainty that belongs to people who have been broken open and have assembled themselves back into something more honest, Now she gets to build a real one. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Both Karen and Michelle have said that looking back, there were signs. Not obvious ones, not the kind that announce themselves clearly, but signs, sitting quietly in the ordinary texture of daily life, waiting to be seen by someone who was looking. So, here is the question I want to leave you with tonight, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Would you have spotted the red flags? And more than that, do you think it is even possible to fully know another person? Or are we all at some level trusting a version of someone that they have curated for us? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and this is exactly the kind of question I think is worth sitting with together. And if you thought this story was something, if it stayed with you the way it has stayed with me, then I want you to make sure you are subscribed, because the next story we have coming is the kind that makes this one look like a warm-up. Subscribe so you do not miss it, and thank you for watching.